The champagne flute trembled in my hand, not from the bubbles, but from the sentence that landed like a slap in a quiet room. She's ballast, the woman in the emerald sequin gown said, not bothering to lower her voice. If Mason had cut her loose, he'd have the whole coastline by now. A few faces turned, half curious, half thrilled by the cruelty. The Magnolia Room at the Hawthorne Grand smelled faintly of magnolia and expensive bourbon. Floor-to-ceiling windows caught the last pale shimmer from the harbor. Behind me, the jazz trio fell into a brushed snare shuffle. In front of me, a cluster of board members pretended not to stare. I stood there, framed by the doorway in a deep burgundy dress I'd picked for my husband's gala. Mason Winslow, my husband of 18 years, had just been crowned visionary CEO of Winslow Harbor Properties. His name was embossed on the acrylic plaques lined up on the stage, his profile blown up in grayscale on the LED wall. It was his night. And apparently I was an uninvited subplot. The woman in green, Eloise Mather, Vice President of Development, the newest star in Mason's constellation, tilted her head, assessing me like a decoration the planner had placed incorrectly. Her earrings flashed when she smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. She brings nothing to the table, she said, lifting a flute from a passing tray as if my presence were a mild inconvenience to her drinking schedule. He's been carrying her for years. A few chuckles. A polite cough from someone who wanted to be seen as decent without giving up their seat in the circle. I recognized almost every face in that ring. Reese Caldwell, the CFO who sent me texts about oyster recommendations. Dahlia Kearns, HR, who'd given me a book on Lowcountry Gardens. Augustus Larrabee, board member whose wife and I shared a Pilates instructor. They were fixtures in our charity dinners, our holiday parties, our wind-blown yacht christenings. They had eaten at my table. And then Mason stepped into the circle, casual as a tide, hand landing on Eloise's waist as if that touch had been rehearsed 100 times. "This is a business event, Lila," he said, soft but not soft enough to be missed. I probably shouldn't have come. The words landed heavier than the glass in my hand. I laughed, or I did something that sounded like a laugh. It felt like the floor shifted under my heels. 18 years of strategy over takeout containers. 18 years of my calendar bending around his schedules, my weekends sacrificed to site visits and launch parties, my patience filling the gaps when lenders hesitated. 18 years of we, now revised to me and you with a single sentence. I put the flute on the nearest tray. The waiter looked at me, eyes apologetic in a way that said he knew more than he would ever say out loud. The jazz trio slid into a brighter tune. On the far wall, a slideshow cycled through glossy photos of waterfront developments. A boardwalk ribbon cutting, a rooftop cocktail, Mason shaking hands in a navy suit. In one photo you could see me in the background, blurred because the camera hadn't been interested. Eloise leaned into Mason, a theatrical whisper aimed to Carrie. "She never understood the business," she murmured. "She's decorative." Dave. The room pinwheeled and then steadied. Something hot surged up my neck and settled into a calm I didn't recognize. The kind that comes right before a storm tears the heat out of the air. "That's enough," I said, not loud, not pleading, just finished. I wasn't speaking to Eloise. I was speaking to myself. A few heads swiveled, curiosity sharpening, instinctively drawn to the edge of a conflict. I could feel Reese's discomfort from across the room. He cleared his throat and looked at his shoes. Dahlia's mouth pressed into a line, sympathy warring with self-preservation. Augustus studied the ceiling like it held an evacuation plan. Mason's eyes flicked to mine, and there it was, the look of a man weighing optics. He didn't remove his hand from Eloise's waist. "You know how this looks," he said, the words slow, careful. "Don't make a scene." I let the scene roll over me like water. The lights softened for a speech. The MC tested a microphone, oblivious. Somewhere near the stage a photographer adjusted a lens. Eloise's perfume, jasmine, sharp and sweet, crowded the air between us. I had a mental flash of last winter. My hands deep in garden soil, real jasmine curling around the trellis, patient and stubborn, coming back even after a frost. The stupidest thought, I wished I'd worn different earrings. What none of them knew, what not a soul in that glittering room suspected, was that the decorative woman in the burgundy dress had paid for more than the flower arrangements. I could have bought and sold this ballroom before the dessert course. There were paper trails in places they'd never think to look, signatures that would make the MC's voice crack if he saw them. But this wasn't the moment for paperwork. I smoothed the fabric at my hip and stepped out of the doorway toward the exit. Not a flinch, not a wobble. My heels clicked once, twice on the parquet. A woman I barely knew, one of the junior analysts from leasing, caught my eye and shook her head, tiny and quick, as if a secret alliance had blossomed between us in a single second. I filed her face away. "Lila," Mason called, the syllables of my name flattening under the weight of his careful voice. "Don't be impulsive." The word almost made me smile. As if he'd ever seen what I could do when I wasn't busy softening the edges of his ambition. As if he knew anything about the line between patience and permission. I didn't answer. Eloise turned her shoulder to me, triumphant already, the kind of triumph people get when they mistake a pause for a period. A catering cart wheeled by, stacked with plates of miniature pecan pies. I took the side door into the corridor, where the hotel's elegant chaos turned into the workmanlike hum of service hallways, scuffed linoleum, a distant clatter of pans, the real engine that made the evening look effortless. My reflection slid across a narrow gilded mirror, then vanished. In the quiet my phone buzzed. A group thread of wives pinged with a photo from the ballroom. Mason on stage, a silver statue in one hand, that crisp navy suit the color of promises. Caption: "He did it." My thumb hovered. I switched the screen off and slid the phone into my clutch. I walked through the lobby, past the arrangement of white lilies the size of a child, past the brass elevators with their stubbornly cheerful lighting, past a pair of tourists arguing gently about whether to get key lime pie at the hotel bar. Outside the night had cooled. A salt breeze muscled in from the harbor. Somewhere in the dark, a boat horn made a low, tired sound, as if the water itself were clearing its throat. I stood under the portico lights, steady enough to notice the details. The concierge's cuff links, the crack in the tile where a luggage cart had caught a corner, the way the valet's neon pen painted a quick arc in the humid air. It is a strange moment when humiliation and clarity arrive in the same breath. Everything noisy inside me went quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat. It sounded like a metronome. I handed the valet my ticket and caught my reflection again in the glass. Not a wreck, not even rattled now. Composed. My mother used to say there are only two kinds of composure. The one you wear to please other people and the one you put on like armor. I could feel the difference settling on my shoulders. Behind me, the doors sighed open and a burst of music spilled out. Then Mason's voice, chased by hurried footsteps. "Lila," he said again, closer now, softer, as if changing tone could rewind tape. "Don't leave angry. We can talk after the awards. This is important." I turned. Eloise had followed too, stopping just inside the threshold like a queen reluctant to step into the humidity. She watched us with bright, avid eyes. "I'm not angry," I said, and it was true in a way that startled me. "I'm finished." He flinched, a tiny movement barely there. In the ballroom, the MC's amplified laugh ricocheted off glass and gold. A ripple of applause broke like small surf. "Please," he said, reaching as if to touch my elbow, then thinking better of it with Eloise watching. "This is a business night." "I noticed," I said. For a second, something like confusion ghosted over his face, as if the world had tilted just a degree and all the furniture in his mind had slid an inch to the left. He wasn't used to me choosing a door he hadn't opened for me. He looked past me at the curb, at the valet stand, at the onlookers pretending not to be onlookers. "Don't do anything rash," he said, landing on a word he thought would work. "We have processes." I smiled then, a real one, small and cold. "I'm very good with processes." The valet pulled my car around. My graphite sedan, immaculate because I am the sort of person who maintains the things she relies on. He opened the door. I thanked him by name. People remember when you remember them. People notice everything even when they pretend not to. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced once more at the hotel's glittering facade. In one of the windows, I saw our reflected trio. Me in the foreground, Mason half-turned, Eloise framed by the door like a comma in an unfinished sentence. On the LED wall behind them, his grayscale profile flashed heroic for a second, then gave way to a drone shot of a boardwalk at sunset, the kind of image that makes donors nod and sign checks with their favorite pens. I put the car in gear. Back on East Bay, the traffic was light, the street lamps casting long, patient pools of light. I drove by habit, past the art gallery with the cobalt vases in the window, past the bakery that closes at 4 but still smells like cinnamon at 9, past the church whose bells keep imperfect time. My hands were steady. My mind, a map unfolding. People love to say they saw it coming after the fact. They'll post comments like, "You can always tell with men like that," as if the foreshadowing had been printed in bold. But the truth is uglier and quieter. It isn't a single red flag. It's 1,000 little pink ones that you fold into paper cranes and perch on the mantle because you're busy and generous and very, very tired. What none of them in that room understood, what even Mason had never bothered to ask, was who exactly had stitched the sail that caught his wind. Who had taken meetings under names that weren't mine. Who had learned the ugly grammar of financing and zoning and leverage because she understood that dreams don't stand up straight on their own. I merged onto the Arthur Ravenel Jr. Bridge. The span rose ahead like a clean white sketch against the night. On the right the water lay black and inscrutable. On the left the city lights threaded a careful necklace along the shore. A cargo ship moved like a dark idea toward the sea. It probably shouldn't have come. The sentence used to bruise me every time I replayed it. Now it was a gift-wrapped confession. A line I could hang a whole plan on. At a red light I tapped my phone awake and scrolled to my notes app. 2 bullet points, nothing dramatic. Keys are where you left them. People are who they show you. I could feel the world arranging itself into columns and rows, into steps and contingencies. I could see the exact shape of tomorrow morning, the way a chessboard looks when you've already memorized the opening sequence. I did not feel vengeful and I did not feel kind. I felt aligned. When I pulled into my driveway, the live oaks made their usual lacework of shadows on the brick. The porch light glowed the same way it always did, soft and undemanding. I cut the engine and sat for a beat, letting the silence make its case. In the kitchen the refrigerator hummed. On the counter, a bowl of satsumas I'd bought that morning for no reason except that they were beautiful. I took off my heels at the bottom of the stairs and carried them up like small trophies. In the bedroom I unzipped the burgundy dress with careful hands and hung it neatly. I washed the perfume of the magnolia room from my wrists. I braided my hair the way I used to when I was 22 and broke in planning how to be less of both. On my desk sat a leather folio, unremarkable unless you know what questions to ask. I didn't open it. Not yet. Ritual matters. Timing matters. It isn't the hammer that breaks the glass. It's the angle and the point and the patience that brings them together. Down the hall the guest room bedspread was perfectly smooth. We never used that room. I liked that it was there anyway. Back in the office I stood by the window and watched the street. A neighbor walked his terrier, stopped to check his mailbox, waved at another neighbor, ordinary choreography in an ordinary neighborhood. I have always loved how quiet the world looks from behind a plan. That quiet hum you hear when all the parts start to mesh. My phone buzzed once on the desk, an event reminder from the gala's calendar. After party, Harbor Lounge. I silenced it. Another buzz, a text from an unknown number. Big night, huh? I turned the screen face down. I sat. I opened the folio. Paper doesn't care who underestimates you. Ink is brutally honest. Signatures don't blush. I took a breath and let it all out slowly. Somewhere downtown, a microphone squealed and a roomful of people flinched. Somewhere else, a bartender carved a twist of lemon over a martini, and a woman laughed too loudly, and a man checked the time and pretended he wasn't. Tomorrow morning would come the way morning always does, bright and indifferent. They would wake up to the list of things they believed were true and discover how many of those things were never theirs to count on. I closed the folio and turned off the lamp. In the dark, the house felt like it was leaning forward, attentive. I wasn't angry. I was ready. People like to say love makes you blind. In my case, love just made me exceptionally skilled at reading contracts in dim light. Before Mason had a logo, I had a ledger. Before there was a glossy brochure of boardwalks and rooftop lounges, there were spreadsheets named after birds because that made the numbers feel lighter. Before the first ribbon cutting, there was my old MacBook propped on cookbooks, a Sharpie bleeding through tracing paper, and me teaching Mason how debt actually breathes. I met him at a fundraiser in an old deconsecrated church on Rutledge. A vaulted ceiling, votives repurposed as centerpieces, a string trio trying to make Billie Jean's sound baroque. He had the kind of smile you could see from the parking lot and a way of speaking that made every idea sound like a tide coming in. Mason Winslow. Leather shoes that were always a little too new, palms warm, ambitions warmer. It's not just properties, he told me that first night, hovering by a catering tray like it might take flight. It's community. It's placemaking. Think of a harbor not as a noun but as a verb. I laughed into my wine because the line was ridiculous and because I believed him anyway. He had a sketch for Winslow Harbor Properties. A stack of watercolor renderings of pier houses and a plaza with a fountain that would never be approved by the Historical Review Board. The pro forma was an optimist's poem. He didn't know yet about carrying costs that creep or how interest-only periods end like good weather. He didn't know how hard money smiles at you while counting your seconds. I did. By then I'd already built Finch and Fell Advisory, my boutique firm that specialized in teasing value out of neglected waterfronts and stubborn mill towns. I was the person banks called when their can't-lose developments started to lose. I negotiated with lenders who sent Christmas baskets the size of Labradors. I knew which city councils liked to talk about walkability because they'd just been to Portland, and which ones wanted to hear about parking ratios because their uncle owned a garage. I spoke fluent incentive, historic credits, brownfield remediations, TIF districts, and I was very, very good at math that behaved. Mason and I became a study in division of labor. He charmed donors and city editors. I charmed spreadsheets and underwriters. He stood on stages and spoke about returning the shoreline to the people. I stood in rooms with no windows and explained to a banker from Port Republic why a mezzanine position was suddenly less attractive than common equity if he wanted his grandchildren to know his name. We married at a courthouse because time is also a kind of money, and threw a party under an oak 3 weeks later because joy deserves chairs and cake. Looking back, there were warnings tucked into the bunting like paper fortunes. At our engagement celebration, a friend of his joked, "Lila's the numbers whisperer, Mason's the face." Everyone laughed. Mason squeezed my hand. Somewhere inside the compliment was a reservation that would one day turn into a wall. Finch and Fell grew. So did Winslow Harbor. The first project, Bay Lantern, should have died 3 separate times. Permitting stalled on a moody Wednesday. A lender lost his nerve on a Friday when the markets hiccuped, then found it again on Monday as if courage were a laptop you could misplace. Mason called me from his car, voice bright and aggressive in that way men's voices get when fear is sitting shotgun. "Tell me we're fine," he said. "We're fine," I said, and then I went to work making it true. I restructured the second lien, quietly guaranteed a short bridge with an account no one in his circle knew I had, and called an old contact at Belvedere Partners who owed me a favor fat enough to feed a village. When Bay Lantern opened, the mayor cut a ribbon and a little girl in braids licked an ice cream cone she couldn't control. The paper ran a photo of Mason looking left, hopeful, and called him the architect of the revival, which was funny because the architect was a woman named Corinne who wore black jeans and swore like a symphony. The article mentioned me in the last paragraph as Lila Winslow, his wife, which made my friends furious and me tired. Here's what people miss about building things. It's mostly logistics and scheduling and patience, thin as phyllo dough. It's a dozen boring phone calls that keep one dramatic phone call from happening. It's 1,000 pink flags that you iron flat and label fabric. It's knowing when to nod and when to make a spreadsheet that refuses to nod along. We collected characters as we went the way some people collect souvenirs. Reese Caldwell, the CFO who wore chambray shirts with sport coats and believed in spreadsheets like some people believe in saints. He had a conscience that made meetings longer but saved us from ruin more than once. Reese drank ginger ale at parties and always knew where the fire exits were. Dahlia Kearns, HR with hair like an exclamation mark and a talent for reading rooms so fast it looked like magic. She sent me an essay about women negotiating that I still have in my email starred. Augustus Larrabee on the board, an old money name attached to a new money appetite. He could tell you the provenance of a single malt and how to wrap a scandal in tissue paper so it didn't break in transit. And then there was Eloise Mather, a hurricane with expensive shoes. She came to Charleston from Houston with a resume that turned heads and a field of admirers who hadn't noticed the wake. Eloise didn't enter rooms, she took a bite out of them. The first day she presented a pipeline, she clicked to a slide titled, "Narratives We Can Sell," and looked at each person around the table as if she were choosing whom to eat last. "Placemaking is a story before it's a structure," she said. Mason glowed like a man standing too close to a halogen lamp. Reese looked at me over the rims of his glasses, one eyebrow raised. Dahlia made a note. Later by the elevator, Dahlia said, "She's effective," In the careful tone HR people use when what they mean is she sets small fires and calls it warmth. I never minded effective. I minded carelessness disguised as confidence. Mason loved the momentum Eloise brought him. He loved it the way hungry people love noise. It filled him up, sort of. Meetings stretched later. Reheated dinners cooled on our counter. You should come to more of these, he'd say on the nights he remembered I could do more than pour coffee. You're so good at, smoothing. Smoothing. I wanted to ask if he remembered who had smoothed out the early leans and angry contractors, who had smoothed bankers until their appetite returned, who had smoothed a council vote that was about to break our way into someone else's hand. But asking a question is a kind of confession. You admit you need an answer. I've never liked how that feels. My father used to say, paper is patient. He kept his accounts in a ledger that had belonged to his father, and I learned as a kid that ink speaks a language louder than voices. So when the properties multiplied and the stakes plumped up, I did what I always do. I built a binder that would make sense to me even if I lost a week of sleep. Tabs labeled not with project names but with variables. Water, air, fire, and salt, because predictability bores me and pattern makes me fast. In water, cash flows and covenants. In air, permits, easements, the winds that blow approvals off tables and into the hands of men who golf together. In fire, litigation risk, insurance letters, the places where friction likes to live. In salt, people, their talents, vices, soft spots, the stories they tell themselves about why they do what they do. People are who they show you. You just have to write it down before they convince you otherwise. Somewhere between Bay Lantern and the Riverwalk Lofts, I set up Low Tide Holdings, an understated LLC with a name so boring it turned invisible, tucked inside a family office structure I'd been assembling long before I met Mason. Low Tide invested in distressed maritime assets and occasionally in the people who believed they owned them. It held a basket of convertible notes from projects that needed weather more than prayer. It sat quietly, a well-behaved dog under the table, ears twitching. I did not make a show of it. I did not hide it so much as refuse to announce it to people whose self-esteem depends on being announced to. My name appears on paper where it matters and nowhere else. This is the part where your friend leans over a brunch table and says, "But why didn't you tell him?" And you stab your avocado toast because we don't have language and polite company for the arrangement so many women live inside. You are the parachute and the packer and the plane, and you are also the one who claps when he lands. Mason liked to say, we, when the cameras were rolling, and I, when the article was due. It's optics, he told me once in the car outside a donor's house whose lawn was a geometry problem. People like a singular narrative. I liked solvency. I like sleeping. To be fair, he had gifts. He could get a protester to try a canopy. He could make a zoning board laugh without feeling guilty about it. He shook hands like a promise and remembered the names of the bartender's kids. He wasn't a villain. He was a man who believed the ground would always rise beneath his feet because so far it always had. The ground is patient too. It waits. The first hairline crack appeared when an article in a regional glossy photographed our living room and then captioned my art as on loan. It wasn't, and the mistake was a symptom, not a sin. I corrected it with an email. The second crack was uglier. A panel discussion where a moderator asked Mason how he navigated the financing alone. He never corrected him. Afterward, when I raised an eyebrow, he kissed my forehead and said, "It complicates the story, babe. You know how donors are. They want one hero. Heroes are expensive. They have capes that need dry cleaning." By the time Eloise arrived, the cracks were less hairline and more map. I caught her looking at me once in a meeting, head tilted, curiosity without kindness. She is not cruel the way high school girls are, not exactly. She is ambitious in the way that forgets people have spines. "What do you do for the company?" she asked, faux light, during a lull when she knew everyone could hear. "I keep it solvent," I said, and smiled just enough that everyone could pretend we were joking. She laughed, loud and lovely. Mason reached under the table and squeezed my knee, a signal to play nice. I made a note in salt. There were still good days. There were afternoons when the light on the water turned everything into a promise we'd kept. We adopted a dog that snores like a small machine. We hosted friends and served gumbo so rich it made them sleepy. We built a life that looked good on Instagram and most days felt good in bare feet. And then the gala happened. The sentence, the hand at her waist, the sound in my head like a hinge unsticking. I drove home, hung up my dress, washed perfume from my wrists. and pulled the leather folio toward me the way you pull a chair out for a guest who has come from far away and will tell the truth. I paged through water, air, fire, salt. The tabs glowed softly under the lamp, patient as ever. In water, a line of credit with a covenant tripped if certain ratios slipped. A thing that could be made to happen with a single phone call to a lender who thinks in winters. In air, a set of approvals that renew automatically unless someone reminds the city they do not. In fire, a dispute Eloise had assured Mason would never ignite because relationships are everything, which is true until they aren't. In salt, a list of names and tilts. Reese, ethical, steady, will not lie if cornered. Dahlia, loyal to principle not people. Augustus, self-protection masked as gravitas. Eloise needs a stage. Give her one at the wrong time and she'll dance herself off it. Mason believes in magic, mistakes applause for air. I ran my finger down a page and stopped at a note I'd written months ago in a moment of angry clarity. Don't be the floor. Be the door. Somewhere downtown, a microphone squealed again and someone toasted. Somewhere else, a banker checked his portfolio on his phone and smiled or didn't. My dog rolled over and chased something slow in his sleep. I closed the folio and looked at my reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at me did not appear decorative. She looked like someone who collects keys. Tomorrow I would stop being the person who kept the story simple for everyone else. Tomorrow the paper would talk. There is a peculiar pleasure in knowing the most important person in the room doesn't realize you're the most important person in the room. It's not arrogance. It's leverage. When I built Finch and Fell, I learned very quickly that influence works best when no one suspects you're holding it. If they can't see your hands on the steering wheel, they'll never think to wrestle it away. And Mason, well, Mason thought my hands were busy holding up his world, not driving it. Winslow Harbor Properties was, on paper, his empire. The brand, the interviews, the keynote speeches, all his. But the bones? Those were mine. Started small. A $250,000 bridge loan here. A quiet introduction to an investor there. Mason always thought anonymous angels were just lucky breaks. He loved the romance of invisible benefactors. He never asked why they seemed to appear at exactly the right moment with exactly the right terms. He didn't see that I'd been arranging the spotlight so he could stand under it. By the third project the stakes had grown. I'd folded Low Tide Holdings neatly into the cap table. A silent, unassuming shareholder with no photo on the company website and no appetite for the limelight. From Low Tide I funneled capital, sometimes directly, sometimes through shells so bland their names could have been taken from grocery store receipts. American Holt Palm Supply LLC, East Point Associates. If you traced the ownership back far enough, you'd land in my world. My family trust, my own liquidity from years of restructuring failing developments up and down the eastern seaboard. Money that existed before Mason and would exist long after him. I never made a show of it. In his mind, Low Tide was just one of those long-term equity partners he mentioned to journalists without knowing what the term sheets actually said. In my mind, Low Tide was a lockbox holding nearly 38% of his company. A lockbox with a key only I could turn. When I wasn't injecting cash, I was injecting strategy. Through Finch and Fell, I fed Winslow Harbor Consulting insights, as if they were the product of a hired firm, not the woman sharing his dinner table. Site selection, market positioning, municipal negotiations. Half of the company's most profitable moves were mine in disguise. The irony was almost charming. Mason paid invoices to my own company without ever realizing it. And the accounts? The joint ones were a performance, a facade for friends and family who like the idea of shared finances. In truth, nearly all the money in them came from Finch and Fell's contracts, not his CEO's salary. That salary, in fact, was modest compared to the lifestyle we maintained. Oceanfront weekends, tailored suits, donor dinners. Mason never once asked how the math worked. He assumed it was simply the reward for being successful. Men who assume rarely read the fine print. The fine print in our lives was this. Every mortgage payment, every remodel, every six-figure investment in his golf buddy's tech startup. All sourced from accounts that existed because of my work, my deals, my name on dotted lines he never saw. I kept meticulous records. Not just for my own satisfaction, but because paper is patient and courts are persuaded by ink. Corporate filings, bank transfers, wire instructions, they all lived in my leather folio organized in tabs that made sense only to me. Mason thought my office was cute, a place where I pretended to work when I needed a break from his whirlwind schedule. Cute. like a loaded pistol in a velvet case. Eloise, for her part, had no idea she was poking a bear with a ledger. He thought I was ornamental. That night in the Magnolia Room, when she let the word ballast float into the air, I knew she saw me as a soft obstacle she could push out of Mason's life with a few more whispered suggestions. She'd read me as a trophy wife losing her shine. She hadn't read the ownership structure. And Mason, sweet blinkered Mason, hadn't read it either. In the days leading up to the gala, I'd already been watching the currents. Drathorn Capital, a private equity outfit with a history of swallowing mid-sized developers whole, had been circling Charleston for months. They'd made quiet inquiries about Winslow Harbor's pipeline, fishing for weak points. I'd met Drathorn's managing partner years earlier during a restructuring in Wilmington. He had the patience of a man who could wait years for the right storm to make landfall. I knew what it would take to open the gates for him. On my desk at home, in the fire section of my folio, was a non-binding letter of interest from Drathorn. It sat there like a chess piece 2 moves from checkmate. All it needed was my signature and the weight of Low Tide's shares sliding across the table. The truth was, I'd considered selling my stake before. Not out of malice but out of fatigue. There's a certain loneliness in watching someone collect applause for a performance you wrote. But each time I'd chosen to stay, for him, for the vision, for the quiet satisfaction of seeing it work. I told myself the story was ours. But stories shift. And sometimes the ending writes itself in real time, right there in the middle of a champagne toast. By the time I got home from the gala, the plan was already assembling itself in my mind. Not out of anger. Anger clouds judgment, but out of precision. I saw the steps, clean and sharp. Drain the joint accounts. Trigger the Drathorn sale. Cancel Finch and Fell's upcoming contracts with Winslow Harbor. File for divorce before the market even opened. Each step was legal. Each step was mine to take. And each step would remind them all. Mason, Eloise, every board member who chuckled in that circle. That ballast can also be an anchor. And anchors, when lifted, can sink ships. I didn't sleep much that night, but it wasn't the restless kind of insomnia. It was the kind that hums with anticipation, the kind you get before a launch. At 4 a.m. I made coffee and sat at my desk, the folio open, the tabs fanned like a deck of cards. It struck me then how strange it was that no one, not my husband, not his confidant, not even his so-called allies, had ever thought to ask where the real current in their sales came from. They'd learn soon enough. In the morning the tide would turn. When I woke at 6, Charleston was still half asleep, the streets washed in that soft gray light that makes even the cracked sidewalks look delicate. I'd slept 4 solid hours, the kind of sleep I hadn't had in months. My body knew what my mind had already decided. The hard part wasn't choosing to act. The hard part was waiting to act. I padded barefoot into my office with a mug of coffee, steam curling over the rim. The leather folio was exactly where I'd left it, the tabs like sentinels. Water, air, fire, salt. Today each one would be called into service. First, water, liquidity. I opened the joint checking account online. $642,815.34. The joint savings, $212,409.88. Every dollar had come from Finch and Fell's contracts over the past 2 years. Every dollar carried my name in the small print of an invoice Mason had never read. A few keystrokes and both accounts were drained into my personal business account. Funds fully within my legal rights to move. I felt nothing but efficiency. Mason's personal account had a balance just north of $18,000. His CO's salary already nibbled at by golf trips and client dinners that had more candlelight than contracts. I left it untouched. A man should keep some pocket change for the bus ride home. Next, air, permissions and contracts. On my desk was a $3.2 million consulting agreement Finch and Fell had with Winslow Harbor, scheduled to begin next quarter. The Meridian Point redevelopment, Mason's legacy project. My legacy too, if we were being honest, but he'd long since stopped telling that part of the story. I called Julia, my operations lead. Cancel Meridian Point, I said. Pause. Effective immediately? Yes. And send the termination notice to Mason's personal email, not his assistant. I want him to see it himself. Third, fire the trigger. I dialed Harrison Webb, my corporate attorney. Harrison is the kind of man who treats urgency like a religion. He answered on the second ring. Lila. I take it the gala went poorly? I'm ready to sell my stake in Winslow Harbor, I said. The silence stretched half a second. All 38%? All of it. Offer it to Drathorn Capital before the market opens. Their last letter of interest is in the fire tab. Terms unchanged. Harrison whistled low. This will give Drathorn a controlling interest. I know. It will also give Mason the kind of headache aspirin can't touch. I know that too. Draft the transfer documents and prepare a divorce filing for this afternoon. Any chance this is reversible if he... No. Harrison didn't argue. I'll have the paperwork in your inbox in an hour. Finally, salt, people. I sent 3 texts. To Reese Caldwell. You'll need to review the ownership changes before your 10 a.m. meeting. It will explain a lot. To Dahlia Kearns. If you've been considering other offers, today would be a good day to take them. To Augustus Larrabee. Drathorn will be reaching out. Align yourself early. No explanations, no chit-chat. Just the right nudge to the right people. By 8:45 the folio was shut, my coffee was gone, and I was dressed in a charcoal suit I hadn't worn since my last keynote in New York. Power clothes, not gala clothes. The kind of suit that says I can buy you or I can bury you. Your choice. At 9:03 Harrison confirmed Drathorn had accepted. The deal would be public within hours. The divorce papers were in my briefcase, the ink still warm. At 9:17 my phone started buzzing. Mason. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then it buzzed again, Eloise. That one I declined without a glance. At 9:32 a third call came, this one from Winslow Harbor's main office. I answered. Lila, Gerald Morrison, the CEO said, his voice tight. We have a situation. Mason's here and frankly no one understands what's going on. Could you come in? Of course, I said. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I hung up, picked up my folio and walked to the door. The calm was absolute. The cut was already made. All that was left now was to watch the bleeding start. The Winslow Harbor headquarters sat on East Bay, a glass and steel cube dropped into the historic district like a dare. The building always felt too new for Charleston. Sleek, reflective, self-conscious in a city of brick and wrought iron. This morning its shine looked brittle. Through the lobby's double-height windows I could see Mason pacing, his phone pressed to his ear, his hair less styled than usual. He spotted me before I stepped through the doors, cutting off whoever was on the other end. What the hell did you do? He demanded, striding toward me. People in the lobby paused. Assistants holding coffee trays, a pair of junior analysts waiting for the elevator. I felt their eyes on us. Good morning to you too, Mason. The accounts are empty, he said, his voice pitched low but carrying anyway. And Gerald's saying something insane about Drathorn. That's not insane, I said. That's business. His forehead creased. You sold what? Some stock. My 38% stake in Winslow Harbor, I said evenly. To Drathorn Capital. Effective as of 9:03 this morning. For a beat he just blinked. You don't own. I opened the leather folio, drew out a crisp set of documents and held them out. Low Tide Holdings. You remember them? The quiet partner you used to brag about in interviews. That was me, Mason. I've been your largest shareholder for over a decade. His face shifted, confusion first, then dawning horror, then the tight jaw he got when someone beat him at his own game. You can't just... I can, I said, and I did. The elevator doors slid open and Gerald Morrison stepped out, followed by Reese and Augustus. Gerald's expression was pinched. Lila, thank you for coming. We should talk upstairs. We walked together to the executive conference room, a space designed for deals, all glass walls and polished walnut. Dahlia was already there, along with Eloise, who sat by the window in a black sheath dress, her confidence showing cracks in the form of crossed arms and a tight mouth. Gerald gestured for me to sit. I didn't. Let's be clear, I began, placing the folio on the table. Low Tide Holdings, my company, has sold its 38% stake in Winslow Harbor to Drathorn Capital. That gives them controlling interest. They'll be making decisions about the company's future, including leadership. I glanced at Mason. Especially leadership. This is insane, Eloise said. You're throwing away years of work. His work, because you're hurt about something I said at a party? I met her gaze. Not hurt, Eloise. Finished. I pulled my phone from my bag, tapped the screen, and the recording played. Eloise's voice, sharp and smug, calling me ballast and decorative, followed by Mason's telling me I shouldn't have come. The room went very still. Reese looked down at the table, his jaw set. Dahlia's eyes narrowed. Gerald's face hardened in a way I hadn't seen before. "You recorded us?" Mason said, his voice a half snarl. "In a public space. Perfectly legal," I said. "And now everyone in this room knows exactly how you've been talking about the person who," I tapped the folio, "funded your rise and kept you solvent when banks wouldn't touch you." "You're lying," Eloise said, but it didn't land. I slid another document across the table. "Here's the paper trail. Every capital injection from low tide, every strategic move Finch and Fell advised. Moves you presented as your own. Without them, half your projects would have stalled or died. And yes, Mason, I was sending invoices to your company under my own firm's name, which you paid without ever asking who was really behind them." Gerald picked up the file, flipping through the pages, his eyes scanning numbers and signatures. These match the Shadow Creek reports," he murmured. "The ones we credited for half our market positioning strategy." "Because I wrote them," I said. Mason's voice cracked. "You can't do this to me. You're destroying my company." "No, Mason," I said quietly, "I've simply removed my contributions from it. If it can't survive without me, it was never yours to begin with." Eloise leaned forward, desperation replacing arrogance. "You're going to ruin innocent people's jobs over this vendetta." "Innocent people will land on their feet," I said. "The guilty ones might find the landing harder." No one spoke. Outside the glass walls, the hum of the office seemed to fade. I reached into my bag, pulled out the divorce papers and set them in front of Mason. "These will be served by end of day. I suggest you get a lawyer, though you may have trouble paying one. The house is in my name, the retirement accounts were funded by my income, and most of what you thought was ours was actually mine." Eloise's face flushed. Mason's shoulders sagged, the fight leaving him all at once. Gerald closed the folder and set it down, his eyes meeting mine with something between respect and resignation. "Is there any way to undo this?" he asked. "No," I said. "The tide's already out." And with that I turned, collected my folio and walked out, leaving them to decide whether to tread water or sink. The thing about high tide is that it always looks permanent to people who've never seen the ocean change. By the following week, the water had retreated so fast, you could see every jagged rock Winslow Harbor had been built on. Drathorn Capital moved like a riptide, swift, cold, impossible to fight. By Monday morning, their senior team was camped in Gerald's office with laptops and thick binders. By Wednesday, the first memo hit the company intranet. Organizational review in progress. By Friday, half the executives had private meetings that ended with cardboard boxes. Mason's was one of them. The official reason was redundancy after restructuring, but everyone knew the truth. Drathorn had no use for a figurehead without the current that kept his boat afloat. His severance was lean. The press release was polite. And just like that, the man who'd been on magazine covers last quarter was spending his afternoons on the deck of my house, chain-drinking coffee and watching emails go unanswered. Eloise lasted a little longer, if only because Drathorn wanted to see whether she'd deliver on the pipeline she'd promised. He didn't. Within 2 months, her role was realigned, and she was out, trading her corporate wardrobe for a LinkedIn profile full of euphemisms. The rumor mill said she tried to follow Mason into whatever came next, but even he wasn't willing to split the dwindling spoils with her. Reese Caldwell took an offer from a private developer in Savannah, a smaller firm with fewer boardroom landmines. He sent me a short email before he left. "Your timing was perfect. If you ever need a numbers man, you know where to find me." Dahlia moved to a nonprofit that builds affordable housing, something she'd always wanted. She called it, "Getting Back to Work That Matters." Augustus managed to land on his feet, but not without shedding some of the polish he'd worn like armor. And Mason? Mason drifted. Without a company to introduce him, he was just another man in a tailored suit with no reason to put it on. The speaking invitations stopped. The donor dinners stopped. The calls from friends stopped too, except for the ones who wanted to know if he still had a boat they could borrow. Every now and then I'd see his name buried in the back pages of the business section. Rumors of a new venture that never materialized, a panel appearance at a regional expo where the keynote was a discount cruise executive. Once, a profile in a local magazine labeled him resilient. The photo had been taken on the patio of a cafe that didn't even serve alcohol. Eloise's fall was messier. She tried to pivot to consulting, positioning herself as an expert in strategic repositioning. But Charleston has a long memory and a short patience for people who confuse heat with light. I heard she moved back to Texas. No one seemed to miss her. The city, for all its genteel smiles, knew a spectacle when it saw one. My name never appeared in the headlines. Drathorn's acquisition was the official story. But in the right circles, the truth traveled faster than gossip usually does. At gallery openings, people leaned in a little closer when I spoke. At fundraisers, they didn't ask where Mason was. They already knew. It would have been easy to gloat, but satisfaction has a short shelf life if you feed it too often. What stayed with me wasn't the schadenfreude. It was the clean, unshakable quiet of having removed myself from a structure that had mistaken me for scaffolding. One afternoon about 3 months after the sale, I saw Mason on Broad Street, walking out of a cafe with a paper cup and no tie. He spotted me, hesitated, then smiled, small, tired, almost human. For a moment, we were just two people who had once shared a life, now occupying different shorelines. I nodded. He nodded back. And then we both kept walking. That night I sat on my porch, a glass of Sancerre in hand, watching the last light drain from the sky. The tide was out again, exposing the wet sand and the glint of shells. Somewhere in the distance, a heron moved through the shallows, patient, certain. The city hummed around me, full of people who believed the water would always be exactly where it was. They'd learn. 6 months after the gala, my life looked nothing like the version Mason had curated for public consumption, and everything like the version I'd been building quietly in the background. Finch and Fell was busier than it had been in years. Without the obligation to funnel strategy and capital into Winslow Harbor, I had bandwidth for clients who valued my work in their own names, not hidden behind someone else's. 2 of my newest projects were in Savannah and Wilmington, cities with shorelines as complicated as their politics, and both were on track to deliver double-digit returns. The work was clean, the contracts clear, and every invoice carried my name in unapologetic font. The house felt different too. It wasn't larger, but it breathed better without the constant hum of Mason's agenda in the walls. The guest room became a proper library, floor-to-ceiling shelves holding the books I'd had in storage for years. My office remained the same, foliage outside the window, the leather folio on the desk, but the tabs inside had new labels. Water, air, fire, salt, and one more, wind. A category for the things I wanted to chase, not just control. I traveled more. Not to conferences or ribbon cuttings, but to places that had been on my someday list for too long. Santa Fe for the light, Edinburgh for the stone, the San Juan Islands for the silence. I went alone sometimes, with friends other times. It felt good to choose without asking if it fit someone else's calendar. Mason never called. He sent one email, a short one, about 6 weeks after the sale. I didn't know. I should have. I didn't reply. There are conversations that serve no purpose except to reopen doors I'd already locked. Eloise's name surfaced in the periphery now and then. Someone had seen her in Dallas working for a mid-tier developer, keeping a low profile. The phrase made me smile. Some people mistake invisibility for strategy. Others know the difference. Social circles shifted as they always do. The people who'd nodded along to Eloise's little monologue at the gala were quieter now when we crossed paths. A few tried to rewrite history to suggest they'd always respected me. I didn't bother correcting them. Let people tell the stories they need to live with themselves. Evenings on the porch became my ritual. Wine in hand, dog at my feet, the harbor stretching out in front of me. Sometimes I'd catch the faint sound of laughter from one of the rooftop bars along the water and think about the Magnolia Room. The lights, the sequins, the way the air had changed when the truth finally shifted in my direction. I kept the recording from that night. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it reminded me how fast a tide can turn when you stop trying to hold it back. People still ask in careful tones if I miss the life I had before. I tell them the truth, I never left it. I just reclaimed it. The rest of the world can call that whatever they like. One evening in early spring, as the sun dropped into the water and turned the whole harbor the color of molten copper, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I let it ring out. Then the voicemail icon lit up. I listened. A woman's voice, sharp but a little frayed. You think you've won. This isn't over. I deleted it. The tide was in, the air was warm, and the wine was exactly the right temperature. This, I said to no one in particular, is exactly over. And then I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the wind carry the rest away.